Okay, so I would like to introduce Myron Freeman, our museum director. He had a few words to the members and the others today. I believe there's a couple that are not members that are listening in today.
Welcome, everybody. Can you all hear me? Great. Okay, good. You can never tell, you know? It's not like being in a room live and you get the immediate feedback from everybody. I want to thank our speaker for being here tonight and bringing a wonderful, very interesting program. I'm looking forward to learning about Hogan. It sounds like a fascinating topic. I just wanted to take a moment to talk about sort of this environment that we're in now. Here we are enjoying a Francis Humphrey lecture. And for those of you who have been members for a long time, you know that this series goes back quite a ways. Our membership includes free admission to programs as well as to the museum, but also to programs. This venue, the Zoom venue, and all of our social media content is being offered to the public basically free of charge. And that has a lot to do with the environment we're in and wanting to make sure that people are able to connect with Nevada history whenever possible. It's very important to us, and we're delighted to be able to share that. I would, though, like to ask that those of you who aren't members, if you might consider giving a donation to the museum to help us cover the costs of staffing and all the supplies that we need and everything that it takes to run a museum, particularly in these difficult days when we've had to cut our operating days down due to budget cuts. So I'm just putting that out there that we're absolutely delighted to share this content with you. But on the backside, you might consider sending in a donation to the museum. You can mail it in to 600 North Carson Street to the Nevada State Museum. You can stop by the museum and drop it in the donation box. Certainly, it's not a requirement, of course, or anything like that. But again, our structure right now is to make this content available so everybody can enjoy it. And if you just give it we would appreciate your consideration to help support the museum, particularly during these difficult times. So that's my message. Again, just keep that in your head and your heart as you enjoy our programs. And I want to thank Mina for all the work she does to bring this out to the general public. So with that, I'll turn it back to Mina, and thank you all very much.
Thank you, Myron. So now I would like to introduce our speaker. She is the author of, I have the worst lighting in my room. I don't know if you can see that. There, she has the book up. The author of this book, Logan, The Honorable Life and Scandalous Death of a Western Lawman. She is, she mentioned to me her regular life a mediator, but got into historical research as a freelance writer, and found out that her great grandfather, right? Is that was in Nevada, was a lawman in Nevada, and so doing the research, she found out all kinds of wonderful things about Nevada history and how that all fits together, and decided to share it with everyone with a book and now with a lecture. So Jackie, if you could go ahead.
Thank you, Mina. Let me get my PowerPoint up here. So thanks so much for this opportunity to share my great-grandfather's story. And especially, I know when mine and I were scheduling, I don't think we imagined competing for airtime with the presidential debate. But here we are, and I'm delighted that so many of you are showing an interest in learning more about Tom Logan, his personal story, and also his place in Nevada history. I'm also going to spend some time this evening connecting some dots between the past and the present. So that's why we're calling this Then and Now, on the trail with Sheriff Tom Logan. My personal journey began in 1985 when my mother, who is here, asked me if I would drive her to Nevada to a family reunion so she could meet her Nevada cousins. She was born and raised in Oregon, and her mother, my grandmother, left Nevada in 1914 when she got married and never came back. So Nevada was always a bit of a mystery to our Oregon family. So my mother and I went to the reunion in Belmont, Nevada, and at that reunion met a lot of relatives, and I was particularly perplexed by the number of different stories I heard about how Tom Logan died. I knew he had been a sheriff. I knew that he had died, was killed in his third term, and that was a real tragedy in the family. And that was all I knew. So some people said he was ambushed escorting a prisoner across the desert. Someone else said he was passing by a saloon and a gunfight broke out. He was ambushed by a prisoner in a jail. And then there was the one that was closest to the truth that was actually shared with me by the nephew of the man who killed my great-grandfather, who we had invited to the reunion to share in our mutual histories. And his version was that Tom Logan was shot and killed on the steps of a brothel while visiting there. So wanting to find out more, my mother and I went to the museum in Tonopah that had just opened, the Central Nevada Museum, which is a great spot to visit if you get that way, and asked if there was any information on Tom Logan. And the person there handed us an envelope and said they knew the Logans were going to be in town and to give this to them if anyone stopped by. Inside that envelope was the transcript of the preliminary hearing following the murder of Sheriff Logan. It had been recorded the day of the killing. And ironically, that document, I later found out, had been found in the Tonopah dump in the 1950s by a teenager out target practicing in the dump. And he saw this document that said the killing of Sheriff Logan. And as a 14-year-old thought that sounded pretty cool, better than a comic book. So he picked it up and stored it away. And then 30 plus years later, made it available to our family for us to finally find out what had happened that day. So today I want to start with the end of the story rather than starting at the beginning. And the end of the story is that Tom Logan, as a third-term sheriff in Nye County, was indeed shot and killed on the steps of the Jewel House, a house of ill fame located in Manhattan, Nevada, a mining camp northeast of Tonopah. And he was sleeping there in the early morning when May Biggs, the proprietress of the Jewel House, who had formerly had a boarding house in Tombstone but got ran out of Tombstone, was trying to get everyone to leave before dawn, and there was one fellow lagging behind, and she had an altercation with him. He wanted to sleep on the sofa, and he jerked her arm, she screamed, and Sheriff Logan came running from his room to her aid. He ejected the gambler out of the Jewel House, out into the street, and something I know he had done many times before in many different capacities. And this gambler, Walter Barrio, turned around and shot him 5 times. The sheriff came running toward the man who shot him, wrestled him to the ground, and stopped the piano player from killing Barrio before the sheriff died himself within a few hours. Barrio was taken into Tonopah and held in jail, awaiting trial. The sheriff's own brother was adamant about protecting the killer from a lynch mob. And so the trial was scheduled for 3 months after that killing. 3 months after the killing of an unarmed sheriff, Walter Barrio was found innocent. And that fact absolutely confounded me. And that was really the motivation for digging a little bit deeper to see why this particular incident turned out to be an unlikely outcome. And that's something that I'm going to reveal a little bit more about as we move forward. So the first thing I thought we needed to do is, in really understanding the circumstances of the trial, was to get to know Tom Logan. And here we have Walter, the assailant, who had come from the Sacramento area, actually, where he had been in trouble before. He was married and had a daughter and was gambling at the Jewel House that night. So who was Tom Logan? He was one of 7 children, the oldest, born on May 29th, 1861, 2 years before Nevada became a state, in Washoe County. His birthplace is Franktown. And his father was a rancher and a tax collector, and built one of the first hotels on what was then Lake Bigler and now Lake Tahoe. His father was a very ambitious man. And this is a photograph of the site where the Logan Hotel was built, an ad for the Logan Hotel. And those of you familiar with the East Shore of Tahoe will recognize Logan Shoals, and a site for not only hikers, but I realize there's quite a few marriages happened there in that very picturesque area. And so Tom Logan's father did not thrive in the hotel business. And like many people in Nevada at that time, went from boomtown to boomtown. He had another saloon in Austin. He was mining in Pioche and Belmont, and eventually ended up in Moapa Valley, where he took up ranching, raising hogs and turkeys, and had a massive vineyard and actually produced wine, supplying the railroad building companies in northern Arizona at that time. Tom Logan, after his mother passed, was the head of the family for most of the time, because his father was gone a lot, and they hired a woman named Hannah Hamblin, who is the niece of Jacob Hamblin. And those of you who know your LDS history, Jacob Hamblin was known as the buckskin apostle for Brigham Young. So Hannah was a bit of a rebel and kind of pushing her Mormon heritage, and came to work for the Logan family to help care for Tom's siblings. They found their way to each other's heart and married, and they would have 6 daughters and 2 sons, eventually moving to Central Nevada, where Tom took up ranching and was first elected sheriff in 1899. The Belmont, Nevada, at that time was the county seat for Nye County. Tonopah didn't exist. And at the Cosmopolitan in Belmont, which was the gathering place for out-of-town visitors and locals to wet their whistles, was a very popular destination and gathering place. And you see Tom Logan standing on the steps of the Cosmopolitan. To your right is the Cosmopolitan in 1985 during the reunion I attended with my youngest son, who was named Eric Logan Boor, and given the Logan name before I even knew about Sheriff Logan, because I named him after my grandmother. Tom Logan is pictured here with some of his deputies. As you can see, he was usually with a cigar. That was one of his trademarks. was to have a cigar handy. And he was, as a sheriff in those days, it was as if they were responsible for not only anything to do with law and order, but also nuisance, dangerous buildings, and so forth. I actually made a list here of some of the responsibilities and duties he had as sheriff. He was the assessor, and he collected taxes. He issued business licenses. He rounded up jurors and witnesses for court proceedings. He conducted delinquent property sales, the proverbial sheriff's sale. He provided and oversaw the adequacy of jails and voting booths when there was an election. He initiated the first dog licensing program in Tonopah. He helped to enforce the spit ordinance because it became very clear that spit was not a very healthy thing to have lying around. So there were rules against spitting in public. He oversaw the proper disposal of garbage and dead animals. As you might imagine, dead horses were dumped on the edge of town, and that also created health hazards. Of course, he was responsible for breaking up conflicts, and he had the practice of taking troublemakers to the edge of the county line, which in Tonopah wasn't too far. Esmeralda County and Nye County, their property line runs through Tonopah. But he would take them to the edge of town, toss them a few coins, and ask them to hit the trail for their own good. So he just moved the problem out of his jurisdiction. And ironically, at the time that he was killed in 1906, he was heavily advocating for an ordinance against carrying concealed weapons in towns. It was his firm belief, based upon his experience, that in the event of an argument or a conflict or a dispute in a poker game, that if there was a gun handy, a bad situation would get worse. So Tonopah at the time, in 1906, was this vast network of mining claims. You can see Tonopah here in the center, and the railroad came to Tonopah in 1905. So Tom Logan, in many ways, if we go back to 1900, Nye County is 18,000 square miles. And in 1900, there were about 1,000 people in that county. It took Tom about 8 days to travel the full distance of Nye County in a horse and buggy. So it was huge and sparsely populated. 6 years later, there were tens of thousands of people in the area, a full-blown boomtown with Tonopah, and it was a time of incredible growth. And I said he kind of went from being, Andy of Mayberry to a full-on metropolitan area with all of the challenges that come with that. So Nye County was that in that time period showed enormous growth. And up here we have the Belmont Courthouse in the late 1800s, when it was the county seat for Nye County. And here down below is the arrival of the railroad. You can see it was a bustling boomtown. And over here, you can see the new county courthouse, which was built in 1905. Tom Logan was the last sheriff to occupy the Belmont Courthouse and the first sheriff to occupy the Tonopah Courthouse. It was a thriving time, and this is one of my favorite then and now pictures, which shows the Tom Logan Saloon here in the background. It's called the American, and this was in the center of Tonopah at the intersection of Main Street and Brochure, where they would have their drilling contests, mining competition, and to this day, Tonopah still has those competitions. Also in 1905, it was an interesting time. It was, as today, we know that there is an inclination to perhaps mix politics with a pandemic. And in 1905, there was a tremendous competition between Tonopah and Reno, competing for being the hub, the economic hub of Nevada, because Tonopah was thriving and threatening to draw attention from Reno. So Reno would play up how unhealthy and unsafe it was to go to Tonopah, and Tonopah people would do just the opposite, to play on the risk of a disease, a plague. There was also racial strife, as we are experiencing today in this time period. In fact, the Los Angeles Herald headlines in March of 1906 read, "Race war stops in Nevada camp. Trouble between miners checked by sheriff." This was a national story. Berlin, some of you may know where the Berlin mine camp is, a one-camp mine located in the far northwestern corner of Nye County, was populated with mostly Portuguese, Italian, and Basque workers. However, when the company management began exclusively importing Basques to replace Portuguese employees, resentment festered. And this is the following account, an excerpt from the following account in the Tonopah Sun, regarding what happened when it was reported back. It said, when Sheriff Logan received the call for aid from Berlin on March 1, he telephoned at once from Austin to McKnight, manager of the Desert Auto Company. The automobile had been in the area for about 3 years, who was commendable with his promptness and zeal. Rush Johnson and his big car to the courthouse. There, Thomas Murphy and A. Gelzine were sworn in as deputy sheriffs, and piling into the auto, they were off for Manhattan, lurching and pounding through mud and truck holes. Manhattan reached, Scott Hickey and Hugh Willis were added to the valiant little force, and they early next morning started for Berlin. Johnson says that the road from Cloverdale to Berlin was the worst he had ever encountered, broken by steep pitches and rocky defiles, and filled with mud and snow. Through the night, they pounded along with lights out as the water in the gas lamps were frozen. On reaching Berlin, they got out of the car on the edge of town, and revolvers in hand, they scattered through the streets, holding up everyone they met, driving the excited men before them into the big store building. In almost no time, 40 frightened Basques had been rounded up, and a pile of guns ranging from 22 to 45 caliber were in the deputies' possession. They went on to adjudicate the fellows that they had arrested, and they were given the choice of paying a fine and being released or being jailed. And in the end, it was a bloodless breakup of a potential riot with a lot of bad outcomes. Manhattan, Nevada is the mining camp where Tom Logan was killed. This is a photo of Manhattan around 1906. And today, the site where the Jewel House stood is at the, would be the kind of the northwestern end of Manhattan, below Mustang Mountain. And the photo over here is what we believe to be the Jewel House. It's not a sparkling gem as we might have imagined, but this photo was taken by the nephew of the man who killed Tom Logan back in the 70s. Tom's funeral was the largest funeral in the history of Nevada to that date. The entire county closed down, the schools closed, the mines closed, which was a very rare thing, and folks came to bid Tom Logan farewell. He laid in state for a couple of days at the Opera House and waiting for his sister to arrive for the funeral. And Another relative wrote a relative, I have a copy of the telegram saying that we expect you soon. Tom's keeping very well. So it was at that point where I learned that bodies were put on beds of ice so they could keep well on display. Some of the historical figures connected to this case and story. You can see here at the bottom of the slide are some names that you likely will recognize, certainly from around the Reno area: Pittman, Wingfield, Butler, McCarran, Audie, and Earp. 1899, the Nye County District Attorney was Jim Butler. 1900, Jim Butler made the big silver discovery that ignited the last great gold and silver rush of America. 1901, a cowboy gambler comes to Tonopah from Oregon to try his luck with a few pennies in his pocket. Was George Wingfield. The person who operated a saloon on Main Street in 1902 was the Northern Saloon, owned and operated by Wyatt Earp. Elected to the Nevada State Senate in 1903 was Tasker Audie. Elected Nye County District Attorney in 1904 was William Pittman, he and Bale's younger brother. In 1905, a young attorney came to Tonopah to salvage his legal practice. And this was Pat McCarran, who had recently passed the bar in Reno and got into some legal entanglements in Reno and thought he could start fresh in Tonopah. So he was new in town. In 1906, an investor in the mines of that area worth over $30 million was George Wingfield. That's what kind of initiative and accomplishment he had. And in 1907, Nye County's new district attorney was Pat McCarran, who, by the way, had the largest salary of any public official at that time in the history of Nevada, even higher than Governor Sparks. And the reason his salary was so high and his station so easily acquired is because he had accomplished what his family called the McCarran miracle. Pat McCarran was one of the killer's attorneys. So Jim Butler, we talk about, then and now, in the years to come, acquired massive wealth and is annually celebrated in Tonopah as the founder of Tonopah for Jim Butler Days. He was a longtime friend and supporter of the Logan family and is actually buried here in my hometown of Sacramento. William Pittman was the prosecuting attorney in the case and did not live up to the expectations of many of the people following the case. And he was later left Nevada and moved to Hawaii and became Hawaii's Attorney General. George Wingfield, by the age of 30, as we said, was worth $30 million and owned most of Nevada's banks. That's the path that he took following his time in Central Nevada. George Wingfield is of particular interest to our family because there are some folks who theorize that George Wingfield had Tom Logan killed because at the time, Logan would not side with the miners union or the mine operators, the owners of the mines. Wingfield had begun a history of certainly buying politicians, and Logan wouldn't cooperate. We also wonder if perhaps Logan would give a heads up to Wingfield when there were properties delinquent for property taxes, and Wingfield would come in and buy those properties at a low, cure the tax lien and acquire properties that way. So there was a lot of wheeling and dealing going on. Tasker Audie, when he first moved to Nevada around 1900, befriended Tom Logan, and they spent a lot of time on the trail, and he writes about him in his book. There are letters that Tasker wrote to his mother. He became Nevada's 12th governor, and during his term, women got the right to vote. Pat McCarran, as many of you know, went on to serve as a US Senator for 21 years. However, the story that is not in his personal notes is that he was not the only attorney on this case representing the killer. He was in fact the second chair. He had been in the courtroom the day that Walter Barrio was arraigned, and being a man of ambition, thought that this would be a high-profile case and worked his way onto that team and became an attorney of record the day the trial started. These are all court documents that we dug up. And Stephen Flynn was a seasoned attorney from, I believe it was from Michigan, and the co-counsel, and led that case. However, Stephen Flynn committed suicide a couple of years later, so Pat McCarran could tell the story any way he wanted to, and frequently did, according to his daughter, Sister Margaret. Sister Margaret was probably one of the most fascinating interviews I had in the late 1980s. She very kindly invited me to the McCarran Ranch out in Sparks, and I spent a couple of days with her. She was the first to tell me that she thought George Wingfield had had a hand in Tom Logan's death, and provided enough information for me to follow some leads. And I did find out that Walter Barrio did spend time as a bodyguard for George Wingfield following the killing. There was a moment when she told me that her father was particularly creative in the courtroom, and that he would frequently have her and her friends skip school, come to the courthouse, sit with her on her father's side of the courtroom for someone he was defending, to make it look like he had supporters and family. And I said, wow, it's kind of like he treated the courtroom like a theater. And she said, well, I think that's accurate. And then she looked at me over her glasses and she said, but he's not on trial here today. So I kind of let that go. But I did find a case where Pat McCarran made such a compelling argument to a jury over the innocence of a supposed arsonist that the jury didn't leave the box to deliberate. They just all looked at each other, nodded, and that was the end of and said he's innocent, and off he went. But he was particularly gifted as an orator and a persuasive man. And finally, then Wyatt Earp was then and still is a Wild West legend. I have one little excerpt I wanted to read to you. Tom Logan, as far as I know, is the only person credited with ever taking away Wyatt Earp's guns and living to tell about it. And the story came forward after Tom Logan was killed, and people were remembering him, and a common friend shared this information. Said one night, Earp became drunk, and his wife came into the place to which he was drinking and tried to get him to go home. The man slapped her face by way of reply, and the act roused the ire of a young miner who was also drinking. A fierce altercation followed, and Earp rushed out of the place to his own saloon down the street and came back with two big six-shooters swinging in his hands and breathing blood and sudden death for the man who had defiled him. Sheriff Logan was called to the scene, pushed his way to the center of the fray, caught Earp by the arm, and without raising his voice, talked Earp into giving up his guns. Logan did not know what fear was, and he always tried to stop trouble by peaceful means, although there was no better hand with a gun in the county than he. Tom Logan was 6'4". I think that gave him quite an advantage. So what impact did Tom Logan have on Nevada history? And I think we can certainly say, well, that depends on who you talk to. And so here are some thoughts. He invested in the growth and promise of the district. This is Main Street, Tonopah, and you can see his saloon here, along with the trees he planted. He got kidded a lot about planting trees. He was very, very inclined to grow some shade. And here, the same street area in 1915, and today the Mizpah Hotel has been restored and is a fabulous place to stay and dip your toe in history. He helped place Tonopah on the world map to usher Nye County into the 20th century. And this again is the intersection of Brochure and Main Street in downtown Tonopah. He left behind assets that the family could build upon, and but he also left the family clouded by shame because of the circumstances under which Tom was killed and the fact that the killer was acquitted. This is a long shot of where the Logan Ranch currently is in Smoky Valley, and it's owned by the Boor family, who purchased it in 1919 from Hannah Logan. This is the main house of the Logan Ranch at that time. He paid the ultimate price in the line of duty. This is a picture of his grave at the time of his death. A recent picture of his grave in Tonopah. He gets a lot of visitors and a lot of little coins and mementos. In 2011, he was posthumously awarded the Purple Heart and Medal of Valor for his public service, and again, having been killed in the line of duty. Sheriff DeMaio at the time said, you know, I can't say that it made a difference as to whether he was standing on the steps of a brothel or on the steps of a church. He was still doing his job. In 2011, several of the Logan descendants gathered and were grand marshals in the Jim Butler Day Parade. This is the courtroom where the trial was held in the courthouse, and more cousins. Tom Logan had 8 children. My grandmother had 11 children. Those 11 children had 40 plus children, and those 40 children, I've lost count how many children and grandchildren they have. So Logan has quite a few descendants. It was a real honor to be invited to the National Law Enforcement Memorial Police Officers Week in Washington, D.C. To represent the life of a fallen officer from days gone by. And I had the distinct privilege of signing the book at the Smithsonian. I was telling some folks earlier that it was always exciting when someone visiting from Nevada came by, and we're so pleased to see a Nevada story being featured. This was also an incredibly emotional time for me, even though I did not know Tom Logan. I met a few people who had known him, but I was not prepared for the number of descendants and survivors of fallen officers. To purchase this book with a note of appreciation that they were encouraged and heartened that we were remembering a fallen officer from well over a century ago. That's a primary concern of those who have lost peace officers in their family, that they not be forgotten. And so here's a look at my camp working on the book. And then what the book looked like upon receiving it. And I wanted to just share with you a few tips on the type of research that I did. It was very important to me to tell the story that I found. I didn't know if I was going to find a scoundrel, you know, or someone I would be embarrassed to be related to, but I just kept digging. And so the book has over the sources of over 28 interviews, 36 manuscripts and letters, 35 newspapers and periodical sources, 34 reference books, 486 endnotes, 100 plus photos from Nevada history are in the book, and there are 15 period poems. In my research, it was just a delight to see how prominent poetry appeared in the newspapers. And some of them are pretty funny and profound and heart-wrenching and really do give us a good sense of that time period. And then finally, for those of you who are interested in what I say, digging up gold on your own family and researching it, these were some of the places I went. Certainly family archives. I contacted cousins, distant cousins, letting them know anything they had I would appreciate. And one cousin's wife, I think it was, very distant, had 3 letters that Tom Logan had written the month before he died. And those letters were to his daughters, 3 of his daughters in Oakland, California, where they were going to business college. And one of the tactics that Patrick McCarran used in his case against Tom Logan was that he had abandoned his family and didn't care about them. And no one could really refute that at the time, apparently. And yet in these letters, he was sending money, he was praising them, telling them to stay in school, he wanted them to be independent women, and that he and his wife were planning to come visit soon. And in one of the letters, it also said, your father is about to come into more money than he has ever known, and we'll see you soon, basically. And we still don't know what he was talking about. So check out what's in the attic in those shoe boxes. Print resources, books, newspapers, and periodicals. Public records. The county clerk in Tonopah, Nye County clerk, was an invaluable resource and came to really love the Sheriff Logan story, and were on the lookout and would call me when they would find things. Looking for people of the time who may be linked to the story. And for instance, Tasker Audie's book writes about his time with Sheriff Logan. Looking at collections in museums and historical societies. Within historical society populations, their membership, there are a wealth of folks who, if you just start asking questions, they'll say, go talk to so-and-so, he knows all about that. And then cultivate partners, historians and educators and history professors at the university, would let them know what I was looking for, and they were very willing to share what they know. The internet, of course, is there, and then in the media, spreading the word, getting a little news coverage to let the world know that you're looking, that you're researching, and this is what you found. So it is just building a great network. For those of you who are interested in spending some time in the area that Tom Logan frequented, on my website is a link to a brochure that accompanies the book based upon page numbers. And you can go to Tonopah, don't drive through this time, stay at the Mizpah or the Clown Motel if you're really, there you go, mine is showing off the brochure. If you're really inclined to have an adventure, stay at the Clown Motel next to the old cemetery, which I've done and would do again. And take a day and drive out to Belmont and over the hill to Manhattan, out to Smoky Valley, and back to Tonopah, where Tom Logan is buried. And so as I'm getting close to closing here, I want to say a word about history. And this is a, these are 2 photographs that one is heart-wrenching and one is heartwarming. And 10 years ago, the Belmont Courthouse had a leaky roof and boarded up windows, and it was decaying from the inside out. And over the last 10 years, the Friends of the Belmont Courthouse formed, raised money, put on a new roof, all new windows. They're restoring the staircase now. Our family sponsored a new door for the sheriff's office. There are windows sponsored by people, and this amazing effort to save this true jewel of a building in Belmont. It's opened for touring usually around the 4th of July, Labor Day, prominent holidays. And then the heartbreaking photo of what's left of the Cosmopolitan. It's heart-wrenching. It's there. It's almost as if it's burying itself. And so my word about history to all of you is to preserve what you can as honestly as you can. History is our great teacher. It's a mentor. It's a guide, and it has the power to protect and to enlighten and to motivate us. It is the one constant, and so much of the Tom Logan story was on the verge of disappearing. And so because of and I say all of the people that helped me put this story together, I can feel good about my grandmother's legacy, and knowing that her leaving Nevada and the heartache that she had in the loss of her father, which created a lot of behaviors and negativity in the family, because Tom Logan's wife was very bitter and forbid her family to even visit his grave. It was a very healing thing. And so I just want to honor my grandmother and know that for those of us still living, we can put a lot of the turmoil and anxiety to rest. So the Sheriff Tom Logan story is dedicated to the families and descendants of fallen peace officers. We become one in our struggle, our healing, and our triumph. Happy to answer questions. So Mina, you're muted, Mina.
Sorry about that.
Are you fielding questions?
Yes. If anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask a question or type it in the chat, we can answer questions.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm sorry. You probably addressed this, but I missed it. I was
Hi,
changing.
Eva.
Hi. I was changing my son's diaper. I was wondering, how was he exactly? Why was he killed? You know, you said that the guy got away with it.
Right. The guy got away with it by saying he killed the sheriff in self-defense. That the sheriff had pushed him out and he feared for his life. And when he turned around and reached inside his coat, the sheriff was standing in the doorway of the Jewel and said, "Don't pull that gun." And Barrio still pulled the gun, and he shot once and it broke a window, which sent the piano player and May Biggs back into the Jewel house. And Tom Logan ran toward Barrio to disarm him. And in approaching him was shot 5 times. So McCarran's case was a major theatrical production, indicating that Barrio feared for his life, that the sheriff was in a compromising space at the time, that he had abandoned his family, and also he was supposedly embezzling money from the county, which was another charge. And it's actually interesting, the embezzling was, we would think of it as embezzling today, but in those days, you won't believe this. He would collect taxes, and he would collect money maybe from his saloon, and he put it all in his pocket. All the money went into the same pot, and then at the end of the year, when taxes were, can I mute you, Eva?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
When taxes were due, he would just reach into the pot of money he had, and he would balance out his books. So there was this practice of commingling funds, and I was suspicious about it, but I read ahead a good 10 years after he was killed, and I found in 1910 it was Keith Pittman who first said to the county, "Don't you think we should have a separate account for the sheriff and the treasurer and the recorder, and not have just all the money go into a single pot?" And that was actually a proposal by Keith Pittman in 1910, because the sheriff, after Tom Logan, disappeared on a train somewhere between San Francisco and Tonopah. And in his disappearing, his accounts were all difficult to track. And so they didn't know whose money was personal and whose money was county money. So, so that's what McCarran was able to put together. Plus, McCarran called himself to the stand and told his own story. And Sister Margaret did tell me she was sure her father had paid witnesses as well, because it was a practice she knew him to do since that trial. So it should have been a pretty open and shut case from everything I've seen. That's my opinion. But those were some of the elements that went into him being acquitted. And he was acquitted on a Saturday, and the next day went to church with Pat McCarran, and was soon on a train to San Francisco, and then on a boat to Panama. So he got out of Dodge.
Are there any other questions?
Thought he was
Anyone else? You got to speak up, even if your mic is not muted.
Just wanted to thank you very much. Great story.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I didn't make any of it up.
So if anyone I know you can't see it. It's awful. I need better lighting.
Here we go.
I have a question.
Oh, okay.
Is the book going to be available at the bookstore?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say.
Oh,
Even though you
sorry.
can't see it from here, if you buy the book at the bookstore, it says signed by author right there. And you get a little pamphlet about visiting Tonopah and following the trail. And if you have some affinity to Jackie or Logan or peace officers, or want a special inscription in your book, just buy it at the store and let Charm know that you want your book sent to Jackie to sign personally and send it back.
Yeah.
So yes, it is available in the store.
Yay.
And
Thank you.
I have a website if any of you have any questions that come to mind later, or maybe in one of your shoe boxes you have a photo that might have Tom Logan in it, which has happened. Please don't hesitate to give me a call or send an email. I'm happy to share what I know. I've been very blessed by a lot of support in building this story.
Now, my grandfather was a sheriff in Del Mar for a while, and he was born and raised in Panaca.
Mhm.
So I have pictures that I don't know who they are.
Anybody who looks 6'4" with a cigar is a good suspect. For Tom Logan's brothers were also in law enforcement, and one of his younger brothers was the sheriff of Inyo County for many years also.
Yeah, I guess the tall ones were sheriffs because my grandfather was 6'2".
There you go. Yeah. They needed every advantage. Had to be good with a gun, good with a horse, good with a rope, and stand out.
an ornery.
And well, you know what's interesting? You should say that. I was looking for some Henri. And in reading a lot of the articles, I read over 20 years of newspapers from, say, 1890 to 1910 in particular. And there were some peace officers who were corrupt and just heavy-handed with a pistol. And I never found one single story out of the hundreds of articles related to Tom Logan where he pulled his gun on someone. He had it taken from him in a scuffle once, which was apparently quite embarrassing. But he never shot anyone, and he was known for his negotiating skills.
Sounds like a good trait for a law officer.
Yeah, it was. He was. I think he was trying to shift from the Wild West to the New West, and I don't think Central Nevada was quite ready for it then.
Yes.
He was actually when he was going to retire, the end of 1906. He was planning to run for the assembly and was looking for a home in Carson City.
Then he'd have more run-ins with those other characters.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a very colorful, dynamic time.
Does anyone else have any questions? You're all gonna rush out and see Charm about buying the book.
Yeah.
Anyway, so thank you very much, Jackie.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
For coming, for staying at your house.
Yeah.
And doing this with us. For the Francis Humphrey Lecture Series, I always try to, give our members a little more, another little story, another little thing. I've done airplanes and, water and fossils and owls and all kinds of things. So it's really nice to get another story about rich Nevada history.
Yeah, very, very rich.
Yes. Thank you very much. And for all my members, the November Francis Humphrey Lecture Series will be the Thursday before Thanksgiving rather than on Thanksgiving, which we usually move it to that third Thursday of the month. It's another author writing about Victorian theater in the West. I have to get all the details together to make the posting on the website, but I will do that as soon as possible. And thank you all very much for coming. And I had a nice evening without debates, so I hope you did too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Jackie.
Very welcome. Visit Tom when you go through Tonopah.